Although Blackhawk had been compelled by force to leave Sauk the previous year, he had since then received word that many Indian tribes east of the Mississippi were ready to rise up and join him, and that the British promised material support. In April 1832, he decided at the invitation of White Prophet to cross the Mississippi and try to plant corn for the next year. Although Blackhawk doesn't tell us why in his autobiography, he chooses to assemble the British band at the abandoned site of Fort Madison, where Blackhawk had first fired against the Americans. By April 6th, they were ready to cross the Mississippi, the women and the children in canoes and the braves and warriors on horseback. They were armed, Blackhawk said, for defense. The prophet soon met up with the British band and told Blackhawk, "We have the right to go where we please, peaceably." The prophet next addressed the warriors of the British band, and said, "Follow us and act like braves. You have nothing to fear, but much to gain. The American chief might come, but would not, nor dare not, interfere with us, as long as we act peacefully." Just 2 days later, without even knowing about Blackhawk and his British band's crossing, U.S. General Henry Atkinson and 6 companies of the 6th U.S. Infantry leave St. Louis and the Jefferson Barracks to move up the Mississippi in response to General Alexander Macomb's orders to arrest Fox, who committed murders of the Menominee in August of 1831. Later, Atkinson's superiors would criticize him for not catching Blackhawk as the ships passed by their location on the Mississippi. Atkinson in his own defense stated, "A reference to dates will show that Blackhawk crossed over 3 days before I set out to execute my orders, more than 300 miles above me, and 5 days before I had any notice of his intentions to do so." Yet this didn't mean Blackhawk was long gone when Atkinson arrived at Fort Armstrong. The British band was only a few miles away. Still, Atkinson had his reasons for not taking immediate action. He wrote, "Blackhawk with his mounted force were reported to be passing up the east side of the Rock River, 6 miles from our position. At first I thought of attempting to arrest his progress, but on viewing the whole ground, I was convinced my force was too weak to encounter the Indian force, and it was not possible to bring the steamboat to bear upon them." Atkinson now had little over 200 soldiers. Blackhawk, on the other hand, had perhaps 500 to 700 warriors at his disposal. Atkinson also had prior frustrating experiences with river travel. While leading the Yellow River expedition a decade before, he was forced to turn around and start a year later when his steamboats failed to navigate the river. Atkinson certainly wasn't a novice to Indian negotiations and river travel, yet the Blackhawk incident would prove to be his most challenging test in his military career. Many would question whether or not more decisive action at this time could have saved many lives. Blackhawk and his British band received the news of the arrival of Atkinson, or White Beaver as the native peoples called him, with great concern. Blackhawk says, "Our party became alarmed, expecting to meet the soldiers at Rock River to prevent us from going up. I was fearful that White Beaver had stationed his men on some bluff or ravine, that we might be taken by surprise." Consequently, on arriving at the Rock River, we commenced beating our drums and singing to show the Americans that we were not afraid. If Atkinson attempted to take decisive action at once, there may not have been a Blackhawk War at all. But Atkinson was drawing from his experience as a frontier negotiator. Just 5 years before, diplomacy and show of force was all that was needed to end the Winnebago War, even though the war had the potential to draw a whole tribe and others into the conflict. Atkinson hoped that diplomacy would win the day once again with Blackhawk. Atkinson stated, "In these circumstances it would be rash and unjustifiable to attempt to seize the pass. I did not feel justified in making the attempt, because if unsuccessful it would give fresh confidence to the Indians, encourage the disaffected of other tribes to join them, and subject a long line of unsuspecting frontier to certain attack and massacre." Diplomacy would be Atkinson's tool of choice in the opening days of crisis. On April 13th, as Blackhawk and his people arrived at Sauk, Atkinson called a council with Keokuk, Wapello, and other Fox and Sauk leaders. Atkinson demanded the surrender of 10 of the principal men concerned in the murders the previous August. Keokuk replied that he was unable to deliver them up because some had joined the prophet's band at his village, toward which Blackhawk was then rapidly marching along the left bank of the Rock River, and the remainder of the perpetrators were with Blackhawk. Keokuk then said, You wish us to keep at peace and have nothing to do with the Rock River Indians. We will do so. In token of our intentions, you see we have laid our spears there together. While you are gone to Prairie du Chien, we will endeavor to speak to Blackhawk's band and try to persuade them to go back. If we do not succeed, I can do no more. Then we will go home and try to keep our village at peace. The one who has raised all this trouble is a Winnebago called the Prophet. On April 19th, Atkinson concludes the council with Keokuk and steams north to Fort Crawford at Prairie du Chien to secure all the reinforcements that can be spared from the garrison. He dispatches an express to Fort Winnebago and the Mineral District, advising Colonel Henry Dodge, well known in the area as a lead miner and smelter, war hero and colonel in the Michigan Territory Militia, to raise as many mounted men as he can from Iowa County. Dodge immediately turns to his friend William "Billy" Hamilton, son of Alexander Hamilton, to raise a company. At Hamilton's diggings, Billy Hamilton immediately starts recruiting a command from among his employees and neighbors. Yet it wasn't only to the men in Wisconsin, at that time Michigan Territory, that Atkinson sent word. On the first day of his council with Keokuk, Atkinson requested Rock River Indian agent Henry Gratiot gather a delegation of Winnebago chiefs and ride to Dixon's Ferry. There they would embark on canoes and paddle down the Rock River to the Prophet's village, in an attempt to convince the Prophet to turn back the British band. At the very same time, Atkinson sent word to Governor John Reynolds of Illinois that the frontier was in great danger, and then told Reynolds to throw companies of rangers onto the frontier. The governor did not hesitate, and on the 16th issued an appeal for volunteers. To the militia of the northwestern section of the state, fellow citizens, your country requires your services. The Indians have assembled a hostile attitude and have invaded the state in violation of the treaty of last summer. The British bands of Sacs and other hostile Indians, headed by Blackhawk, are in possession of the Rock River country, to the great terror of the frontier inhabitants. I consider the settlers on the frontiers to be in imminent danger. I am in possession of the above information from gentlemen of respectable standing, and also from General Atkinson, whose character stands high with all classes. In possession of the above facts and information, I have hesitated not as to the course I should pursue. No citizen ought to remain inactive when his country is invaded, and the helpless part of the community are in danger. I have called out a strong detachment of militia to rendezvous at Beardstown on the 22nd. Provisions for the men and the food for the horses will be furnished in abundance. I hope my countrymen will realize my expectations and offer their services as heretofore, with promptitude and cheerfulness in defense of their country. One of the thousands of volunteers who answered the governor's call was 23-year-old Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was living in New Salem, where he had lived for 2 years. Prior to the Black Hawk War in March 1832, Lincoln announced his candidacy for the Illinois House of Representatives. But with the election several months away, he responded to the governor's call for volunteer militia. On April 21, 1832, Lincoln and the other volunteers gathered at the property of Dallas Scott and began to assemble to Beardstown for assembly. Lincoln rode a horse from New Salem to Richland Creek, where neighbors had gathered to form a company of volunteer militia. The men were officially sworn in, and they began the process of choosing a company commander. The men voted for a captain, and between Lincoln and William Kirkpatrick, Lincoln received 3/4 of the votes and was elected captain. Many years later, Lincoln said this election as militia captain was a success which gave me more pleasure than any I have had since. It would be unheard of for soldiers today to elect officers over themselves, but for well over a century this had been part of the American military system. Militias were made up of citizen soldiers and were supposed to be a trained military force. Yet their lack of discipline and democratic reasoning often left them open to the merciless ridicule from arrogant military officers like Philip St. George Cooke, who later observed the militia during the war. And he said, "I was in the midst of the multitude of citizens volunteers, who are as active as a swarming hive, catching horses, electioneering, drawing rations, asking questions, shooting at marks, electing officers, mustering in, issuing orders, disobeying orders, galloping about, cussing and discussing the war, and the rumors thereof." Here was a fine harvest for the humorous. While the militia was gathering, Indian Agent Gratiot with his secretary, George Covage, and several Winnebago chiefs made their way to the Sauk camp. Bearing a white flag, Gratiot attempted to negotiate with Blackhawk and Neopope at the prophet's village. Gratiot was forced to rely on the Winnebago chiefs as interpreters and hoped they would encourage Blackhawk to return peaceably. However, according to Blackhawk, the Winnebago undermined Gratiot's mission. Blackhawk stated, "They advised us to go on, assuring us that the further we went up the Rock River, the more friends we would meet, and our situation be bettered. That they were on our side, and that all their people were our friends. We must not give up. In a short time we should receive a reinforcement to repulse any enemy. They said they had to use some stratagem to deceive their agent Gratiot in order to help us." Gratiot had hoped to be received well. Instead, Blackhawk and his warriors, encouraged by the news that the Winnebago nation would shortly join them, marched to Gratiot's lodge, hauled down his white flag, and raised a British flag in its place. Blackhawk treated Gratiot like a prisoner, saying it was for his own protection, until the prophet himself intervened. Privately, the prophet warned Gratiot, "Chouteau, you have always been my friend, and the friend of my people, and you and your party must not be harmed, but there is great trouble. My young men will never consent to give you up, and so you must leave without their knowledge. Your canoes are on shore. Go to them when I tell you, and leave instantly, and go with all speed, like wildfire, for the young men will give you chase." Gratiot and Cubbage departed from the prophet's village in haste. Chased by young Sauk and Winnebago warriors, they paddled for their lives, and in a touch-and-go race, eventually outdistanced their pursuers. While Gratiot and Cubbage were fleeing for their lives, Atkinson dispatched 2 young Sacs with a mild talk for Blackhawk. This talk stated, "If you do not come back and go to the other side of the great river, I shall write to your great father and tell him of your bad conduct. You will be sorry if you do not come back. If your hearts are good, I will send an officer to talk with you in 3 or 4 days." Donald Jackson, editor of Blackhawk's biography, states, "When the Indians met in council to discuss Atkinson's ultimatum, Blackhawk was inclined to shift responsibility. Blackhawk said, 'I do not command the Indians. The village belongs to the chiefs. Why do they want to know my feelings? I have no bad feelings. My opinion goes with my chiefs. I will follow them up the Rock River, and my men are all of the same mind." On April 27th, an exhausted and unnerved Henry Gratiot arrives at Fort Armstrong. He delivers Blackhawk's talk that he'd received, and reports nothing more can be done to prevent the advance of Blackhawk, and that nothing but force would avail, stating, contrary to Blackhawk's previous message, that his heart is bad and he will not return. Instead of seeking clarification, Atkinson decides that war is unavoidable. In a letter to his superior, General Macomb, Atkinson writes, "The conduct of Blackhawk and his associates renders it necessary that I should at once take the field, and as far as possible prevent him from doing any mischief." While Atkinson was preparing his regular army units at Fort Armstrong, farther south at Beardstown, Illinois, the militia from all over the state were gathering and were organized by Samuel Whitsides, a popular local figure and Indian fighter. By April 30th, 1,300 men had been assembled. Despite suffering ridicule by the army, the militia was mostly mounted on horses, while the army only had infantry. Atkinson would soon learn that he would need these mounted men if he wanted to catch Blackhawk. Blackhawk had been emboldened by the thought of Winnebago assistance. The Rock River Winnebagos had often intermarried with the Sauk. The prophet himself was born in result of one of these marriages. But as soon as Blackhawk returned to the Winnebago chiefs for help, he was disappointed. Blackhawk stated, "They do not seem disposed to render us assistance. I asked them if they had not sent us wampum during the winter and requested us to come and join their people and enjoy all the rights and privileges of their country. They did not deny this, and said if the white people did not interfere, they had no objection to our making corn this year, but did not wish us to go up any further." The Winnebago had drastically altered their stated position from a few days earlier. This was a devastating blow to Blackhawk. He told his chiefs that they had been deceived, not only by the Winnebago but by Neopope himself, who made the lofty promise on which Blackhawk largely based his decision to cross the Mississippi in the first place. However, Blackhawk was not willing to be a transparent leader about the British band's misfortune and the broken promises of others. Instead, he resorted to fantastic lies to encourage the British band. Blackhawk told his chiefs, We must keep it a secret among ourselves and move on, as if all is right, telling our people that news has just come from Milwaukee that a chief of our British father would be there in a few days. Either out of pride or unwarranted optimism, Blackhawk decided to continue nonetheless. He still hoped to contact the Potawatomis and entice them into going along with his venture. In the month of April, bloodshed had been avoided, but all that was about to change. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and then subscribe to our channel. If you're looking for more info, you can like our Facebook page. If you're curious about why Blackhawk entered into this conflict in the first place, you can watch our previous episode, The Prelude to the Blackhawk War.